I first told the story that you are about to hear around 10 years ago. When I had finished, a woman came up to me and asked, "What war is that story about?" I told her, "Any war you care to imagine." I do hope you appreciate my telling of the two warriors.
As the sun rose above the hills, its rays cut through the early morning mist and hit the steel of the armour and shields of two vast opposing armies. 40 men deep they stood either side of the battlefield, and they stretched to the east and the west as far as the eye could see. For surely today would be the decisive battle in a war that had raged for many years. Out from the front of the ranks rode a general from each side. The two generals met in the middle of the field. These were two men that knew each other very well indeed, for they had met and fought many, many times during the war. And they knew that whatever happened that day, it would be at the expense of many lives lost and many, many wounded. And so they made a momentous decision. They decided that each would send forward just one warrior, and those warriors would fight to the death, and whoever survived would have deemed to have won on behalf of the whole army. As the two generals rode back to their ranks, out stepped a warrior, and the two men walked and met at the centre of the battlefield. They squared up one to the other, raised their swords, and with a clash of steel started to fight. They fought hour after hour, until finally, as the light started to fade, they fell to their knees exhausted. One of the warriors said, "Just let me get my breath back, and when I do, I will rise up and cut you down like your army has been cutting down my people." And the other said, "When I get my breath back, well, I will rise up and cut you down the way your army has been cutting down my people." The first warrior looked up at the sky. "It's getting dark," he said. "Soon we won't be able to see to fight. I suggest we have a truce for the night, and we'll start again at first light." "Agreed," said the other warrior. And with that, they took off their helmets, put down their shields, took off their armour, lay down their swords, and sat facing one another. One of them reached into his tunic and took out a small bronze locket. He opened the locket, and inside was a small coil of black hair, his wife's black hair. "What have you got there?" said the other, and the warrior showed him. "Before joining the army, I used to be a blacksmith, and I made this locket. And that's my wife's hair, and it reminds me of my wife and two children back at home." The other warrior reached into his tunic and took out a small wooden locket, and he opened it, and inside was a coil of flaxen hair. "That's my wife's hair," he said, "and I made this locket because I used to be a carpenter before I joined the army. And this reminds me of my wife and child at home, waiting for me. I never wanted to fight. I was conscripted. I was told to fight." As the evening wore on, the two men sat and talked one to the other, until eventually, as the light finally faded, they lay down with their hands on their swords and went to sleep. At first light, they both awoke. They stood up, they put on their armour, put on their helmets, picked up their shields and their swords, and again squared up one to the other. "So you were a blacksmith," said the first warrior. And with that, he turned his sword point down and plunged it into the earth and held out his hand. And the other said, "And you were a carpenter." And with that, he too turned his sword point down, plunged it into the earth, and took the hand of his opponent. They nodded to one another, turned and walked away from the centre of the battlefield and back to the ranks. And the ranks of troops turned and walked away from that battlefield without one drop of blood being spilled. And on that day, at that hour, the war ended. For they realized by truly knowing your opponent, that person could no longer be your enemy.